It's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to present today. I think this conference is a fantastic opportunity, and to have it on home turf, I think, is really rather exciting. So my paper, well, my research more broadly focuses on approaches to countering extremism. I'm from the UK, and so my research really is focusing on the British context. And I thought this conference was a fascinating opportunity to kind of reappropriate the expression, what would Jesus do, and instead replace Jesus with pacifism. And to ask, in this context of extremism, what would pacifism do? And so I've started to build this idea of a pacifist perspective on countering extremism. When I started this question, it was evident to me that extremism was clearly something that pacifists should be concerned with. So we start with some imagery. The extremism in Charlottesville, evidently incredibly violent. The violence of, let's start with this one here. This is an example of some extremism in the UK. I think, in fact, both of these pictures represent occasions where individuals have driven into bystanders. But we also have the violence of counter-extremism, and I think that's something I'm definitely trying to impress within this paper and within this presentation. The violence of counter-extremism in the context of armed counter-terrorism strategies in the form of a drone strike in that image. And also here, this is an image of the UK's counter-extremism strategy. And something I'll be doing throughout the presentation is to really argue that there's a lot more violence in here that's not just the kind of the armed or militarized violence that we see. But I think the third reason why I really think it's important that pacifists explore the question of extremism is something I kind of discovered when I was asking these questions. And that's actually to notice the precarious location of pacifism in the context of the discourses around extremism and counter-extremism. And to notice that pacifism is a form of extremism itself within this discourse. And so the paper really, for the most part, builds this question. We have the violence of extremism, we have the violence of counter-extremism, and pacifism itself seems to be caught up within discourses of extremism. It offers us an opportunity to actually explore the question of extremism from an extreme perspective. And I think that opportunity is a unique one, and one that we shouldn't miss. So as I say, this paper broadly it builds this question and kind of particularly focuses on the question of violence within counter-extremism. But does so from a pacifist perspective, and so really we should probably kind of understand what I mean by that to start with. A question that has been ringing through my minds over various speakers that I've already heard at this conference, and Dwayne, your keynote presentation earlier today got me thinking about this as well in terms of positive peace and negative peace. Stellan yesterday talking about structural violence. I want us to try and grasp a very positive understanding of pacifism in the sense of not just talking about violence, but really thinking about engendering a positive peace. But the only way I can seem to define for myself what that positive peace may entail is to list all the violences it's trying to stop, which is to some extent rather unfortunate. But there are certainly four that I highlight in this paper, four different types of violence. The direct violence of an actor harming another individual, the structural violence that Stellan spoke of so eloquently yesterday. I always refer to the example of starvation as being a prime example of structural violence. There's no one actor that is doing the harming, but it is so very evident that harm is being caused. I also refer to cultural violence, which is a sort of a third form of violence that Galton added in the 90s. The cultural and symbolic markers in society that continue to legitimize a state of violence. And lastly, epistemic violence, which is probably the newest to many of us and to me as well. This comes from a very, I guess, a postmodern critique of peace, which looks at the idea of the violence that is involved when you take a blueprint of peace and you impose it onto a particular group. And really asks us to challenge and question preconceived notions and epistemologies that we are bringing to the question of peace, and the oppression and the violence that those epistemologies can engender. So if we're taking this pacifist perspective and we're going to question the context of extremism and counter-extremism, this leads us to the question of what kind of peace does counter-extremism produce? And that's the question that governs the majority of my paper. If we want to ask what kind of a peace, what kind of a post-extremism peace is being engendered in counter-extremism strategy, and here I'm referring predominantly to Britain's current counter-extremism strategy, we need to understand what it is that we're countering, what is extremism. So the paper argues there is no one definition of extremism. In fact, the UK currently is trying to put into place a counter-extremism bill through Parliament, and its first stumbling block is it cannot find a legal definition of extremism. But broadly, I have discovered in my research so far there to be three definitions broadly. The first one focuses on violence, sort of synonymizes extremism and terrorism, talk about violent extremism or countering violent extremism, arguing that extremist ideologies are inherently violent, imminently violent, that violence is an end in itself to extremists, not just a means to an end. In terms of countering extremism, if we assume that counter-extremism is going to take every component of extremism and turn it on its head and try and promote its opposite, then counter-extremism in this context becomes the promotion of non-violence. I probably wouldn't surprise too many of you in here to hear me arguing that the UK currently does not promote non-violence. In fact, what a counter-extremism non-violence entails is the promotion of a particular form of violence in state violence, and legitimizing certain forms of violence and delegitimizing others. Legitimizing military intervention, legitimizing inequality or the use of food banks, while at the same time demonstrating the evil and the true violence, whether it's of a bomb in a public square or whatever it may be. So there's a danger then, if we're thinking about what should pacifists do in the question of extremism, there's a danger here, is that if we isolate this violence and we call out this violence, there's a very danger that we will embed and perpetuate other forms of violence, and so we need to be very critical and careful there. I think the second danger for pacifism is that there are many other forms of extremism that are not violent, according to the literature. There's this idea of non-violent extremism. This terminology originated within discourses around radicalization, and the quest to try and understand what it is that will take someone from being a so-called moderate to that final act of terrorism. And it was thought that there was this intermediary stage called non-violent extremism. People that were not violent themselves, but who would play some sort of supportive role, some ideological support or material support to terrorists and violent extremists. And so there was a kind of an upstreaming logic of we need to go to the source of the river to stop the estuary. And so suddenly counter-extremism is not just looking at countering the violence of extremists, but is countering the ideologies, the beliefs and the values of extremists. So suddenly you can be an extremist if you hold extreme ideas. And broadly, I think there are two ways that people conceive of this kind of non-violent extremism. One is to focus on non-hegemonic values. So if we draw a bell curve of everyone's opinion, then extremists are the ones who are in the fringes and the little ends of the bell of the curve, and the moderates are in the center. So when we then think about countering extremism, we see counter-extremism as about promoting those hegemonic values, trying to narrow and extend the height of the center of the bell curve to try and reduce the population at the fringes. So that entails the promotion of hegemonic